Hello and good morning and a very warm welcome to this event, Access to EU Documents, What Next?, which is being hosted by the European Ombudsman, Emily O'Reilly. My name is James Cantor. I'm a journalist and the host of the EU Scream Politics podcast. I'll be your moderator for our two panels this morning. In just a moment, we'll begin our high-level panel, where we will be considering the future of the rules on access to documents. Immediately following, we'll convene a second panel of experts to discuss their experiences using the current system. And I'm happy to announce that what then follows is free and open access to lunch. And if I'm obliged to reveal its contents, it's a sandwich lunch. We really do hope that those of you who are here in person can stay and talk more about these access and transparency issues, which have such big implications for trust in the European project. Now, just a bit more housekeeping. First, this event is being live streamed, and I also want to let you know it's being recorded. Second, you can follow the debate on Twitter, and the hashtag for your tweets is #EODebate. Third, some guidance on how to get your questions to our panelists. For those of you with us in person, please lift your armrest, pull out the microphone, press the speak button, and it's a big help if you could turn off that speak button once you've posed your question. And for those of you online, welcome. You can ask your questions via Slido. To do so, please go to slido.com, enter the same event hashtag, #EODebate, and to check that's working, we'll do a simple poll right now. So I'll give you a moment to navigate your devices to slido.com and to log in by entering the hashtag. The question is, do you think EU access to document rules need to be changed? Do you think EU access to document rules need to be changed? And participating in this poll now should make it easier for you to ask questions later, and we'll get to the results of that poll in a moment. Finally, when it comes to your questions, please do try to be concise, say who your question is addressed to, and give your name and any affiliation. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our first panel this morning with the key decision makers in the EU documents debate. European Ombudsman Emily O'Reilly is an award-winning journalist and broadcaster who went on to become Ireland's first female ombudsman. In 2013, she was elected by the European Parliament as the European Ombudsman, and she's since been twice reappointed to the role, the term of which now runs to 2024. Vera Jourova is the European Commission's Vice President for Values and Transparency. A significant part of her expansive portfolio is linked to upholding the rights of citizens and to making sure relations with citizens are open and transparent. She was previously Commissioner for Justice, Consumers and Gender Equality in the Juncker Commission. Heidi Hautala is a Green politician from Finland and a Vice President of the European Parliament. Ms. Hautala has long been part of efforts to increase the openness of the European project, and that includes, among other cases, bringing litigation against the European Council for access to documents on arms export rules. Reijo Kemppainen is the Director General for Communication and Information in the General Secretariat of the Council of the EU. He's well known to many journalists here in Brussels since he served as chief spokesman to Romano Prodi during Mr. Prodi's presidency of the European Commission. Okay, so thanks for those of you who gave Slido a go. I'm going to see if we can get the results from that quick poll. And we're waiting for some results. And as we do, I will begin introducing the conference's core subject. Wow, there we go. So it seems we do have numbers that add up to 100%. Okay, very good. So it's yes, 77% would like to see the rules changed, no, 23%. Now, Let me just offer this quick overview as a way into the discussion. Up to 25% of cases that the Ombudsman handles are related to transparency and access to documents. That suggests that the EU institutions can't or won't supply the documents that people want to see within reasonable periods of time, if they supply those documents at all. A few people ultimately turn to the Court of Justice for a result, but not many of us can do that. Now, at the same time, pressure has been growing for updated rules on access to electronic messages, instant messages. After all, the access regulation is now 2 decades old, but the previous attempts to make the regulation fit for the 21st century have ended in EU legislative deadlock, even a convenient standoff, you might say. One might conclude from all of this that the EU institutions are laggards and that they are unwilling to allow the Ombudsman, let alone anyone else, to deliver on the promises in the treaties, the Fundamental Rights Charter, and the regulation itself to give citizens the widest possible access to EU documents. Ombudsman, is this a fair summary of the situation? And may I ask in this first round for you to take a minute, 2 minutes maximum in response?
Thank you very much, James. And first of all, I'd like to welcome everybody to this event, both in person and online. And I want to thank the representatives of the institutions very much for coming here today. What we actually are trying to do is not just endlessly debate Regulation 1049, but try and push it along, because it's the people, or the institutions represented by the people on this panel who are the ones with the power. I don't have it. Most of you, I think, don't have it. They have it. It's been stuck, as you've said, since 2008. The Commission, in fact, started working on what in terms of recasting of the regulation in 2005, so that that's 13 years now since the Commission made the proposal. 2011, it made another proposal in relation to the Lisbonisation of Regulation 1049. The Parliament put forward its proposal. The Council to date has not put forward a proposal. Last year, the Commission, as I understand it, offered to withdraw both the 2008 proposal and the 2011 proposal, and the Parliament did not agree with that. So perhaps we might find out more about that. So in terms of our role, we actually see, relative to the number of access to documents requests that are made to the institutions, a very small number. They tend to be the complex ones, the sensitive ones. We find maladministration in actually very few cases, a small percentage of cases, and that is because we deal with the law as it is and not the law that we might wish it to be. So while the Commission is operating, or the institutions operate the law in accordance with the regulation, that doesn't mean that the regulation itself doesn't have faults. So those are the issues that we tend to wrestle with. And earlier this year, we did a survey. We asked people who tend to use the Regulation 1049 quite frequently what their problems were with it. Now, it is a very small survey, I have to say, but I think they did allude to issues that emerge quite frequently. So they would include delays in relation to accessing it, insubstantial arguments put forward by the institutions or the agencies, not taking the current case law into account. And the ECJ has come out with a whole body of case law over the last 20 years, and there is a feeling that is not taken into account or not sufficiently known, either by people who are making access to documents requests, or even indeed by the institutions themselves. The people talk about very different experiences as between institutions and document management system, record management, and so on. So there's a slew of difficulties there, and I think there is a view, as witness has referenced there, that the regulation needs to be updated. It is no longer fit for purpose.
Thank you. Vice President Jourova, what are your next steps? Can you unblock the legislative deadlock with a new initiative? Dare I say it, a new legislative proposal? 2 minutes, please, for your opening thoughts.
2 minutes. Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. What a quick start, Monday morning, such a dynamic event. By the way, I would vote for yes. Yeah. And when I say that, of course, it cannot be the only thing I say. You rightly ask me, what will you do? I would love to unblock it, to withdraw the 2 older pieces of legislation which are not fit for purpose anymore, and to propose new, fully fledged piece of legislation which will reflect 3 things. Case law, as the Ombudsman spoke about, the fact that today we communicate in different way than 10 years ago. I think we inevitably have to reflect what's going on, that the communication and the mere fact that we have not defined properly what is the document in the old legislation, it has to be reflected. And the third thing is less technical, less legal. I think that we live in the era of the increased demand of the people for information. You said, James, that at 12, was it at 12, you will have a sandwich? I won't be with you anymore, it's a pity. It's for free, yeah?
1 p.m. if you can come back.
1 p.m. But the people also want to know whether they will have their sandwich. They simply want to know what we are planning. And we have incredible power over the lives of Europeans. And it is also reflected in ombudsperson's documents that the Commission has a special role and especially strong power. So we, for the sake of the transparency culture, I think that we have to come with new rules. So there are 2 ways. Either we will move, and I am now looking at my co-legislators, unblock it. The Commission will be allowed to withdraw the 2 pieces so that to prepare another one, a new one, which will apply for all the institutions. This is the way it should be. Or the second option, Plan B, which I don't like, but this is what I'm going to do, to prepare the upgraded internal guidelines for the Commission, and then to take it as a benchmark also, or as a starting point for the negotiations with the other 2 institutions.
Thank you, Vice President. I'm going to jump to the co-legislator and then over to you, Heidi. Mr. Kevanen, why has the Council not adopted a position, there having already been 2 Commission proposals and a parliamentary position? Now, I know a couple of minutes is not a lot of space to think, as we say in the access to documents area, or to talk, but I promise we can come back to the issue.
Thank you, James, and I really also appreciate the attempt to move the discussion more on before the co-legislators have spoken. But if you don't mind, I will also try to answer the first questions as well. First of all, forgive me for continuing to wear the mask, but I'm in daily contact with people who are in highly vulnerable positions, so I have to respect them and their health in this unfortunate time. I mean, in one way, what both Mrs. O'Reilly and Ms. Jourova said goes beyond what some of us were preparing for. I mean, the question whether or not we should look at the legislation is also the question that I was preparing to answer by saying yes. What has happened in 20 years? You've seen the rise of our internet, you've seen social media, you see artificial intelligence, you see metadata, you see everything that is happening and changing the whole concept of what access to what means. And during those decades, we co-legislators, you could say that we have a bit stood by and the court has taken the lead, and this is not how it politically should be. Now, I'm speaking for the Council Secretariat, but of course the presidency of the Council is aware of what I'm going to say, but it doesn't bind them any more than anything else that I'm going to say. But in my duty is also to say that on the basis of 10 years of practice and experience from this field, it is my personal opinion that the regulation should be quite urgently looked at, so that it not only is modernized to match the technological evolution that has taken place in the meanwhile and continues at an increasing speed to make our life more difficult, but also looking at from the point of view of the Council. I mean, the Council is there to negotiate and to decide together with the European Parliament when it comes to legislation, but also in areas that are non-legislative. It has important negotiating duties. We are losing the ability to protect what needs to be protected because the lines are being blurred between legislation and non-legislation. And while I would very much appreciate the Commission's readiness to look into a new initiative or some other means of kind of updating this, I think preceding that should be an informal and very open discussion, the way you look at some of the basic issues at hand, i.e. what is it that we really want to do? What is it that we do want to protect? What is a space to think for the Commission, for the European Parliament, for the Council and its member states? And what form, of any, the changes or new regulation would then take before we jump into the formal negotiating process. The recast attempt that was made a few years ago, of which I was the chair of the working party that negotiated that got into difficulties way too long, because way too fast, because the positions became entrenched very quickly. We did not have the space to think, so to speak, between the negotiators in terms of what each other really wanted before we went into that kind of a negotiation that we are so familiar with.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Hautala, the European Parliament, your institution, hasn't wanted the Commission to withdraw its proposals, even though the Commission has said that they are outdated. You're going to want to react to what's been said so far, but also if you could touch on what's your concern there. Again, a couple of minutes, please.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's really a valuable opportunity to discuss this between the institutions. And I must say that without the Ombudsman and without the courts, we wouldn't be even there where we are today. So I'm very open to be convinced that there needs to be a change of the regulation, because the route we have opted for is slightly odd indeed, that we have abundant case law. The courts have needed to give interpretation of what we have written into the regulation 20 years ago. And I cannot praise the European Ombudsman enough in her attempts, or his attempts, your two previous predecessors, in defending the philosophy of the regulation. And it's written into the recitals. It should guarantee the right of public participation in decision making. And this already, I think, puts the bar very high, that if we are going to revise the regulation, then we need to understand that, as I think Commissioner Vice President Jourova has said, that there's an increased demand on public participation and access to information. And that it worries me slightly when my good friend Reijo Kempinen says that we are losing what needs to be protected. And I'll ask a few questions afterwards what you mean with it, or maybe you can clarify, because indeed there are things that need to be protected, but I don't think the review of the regulation should be towards less transparency. So let's see what we come up with.
Thank you very much. Now, I note, Vice President Jourova, that you, I believe, used the words fully fledged piece of legislation. And I wonder if I could sort of press you for details here, because indeed that would be Plan A. You did mention a Plan B, but this is the Plan A. When might your services be in a position to make a new proposal, legislative proposal or communication? Could that be before the current regulation's 21st birthday? After all, the Swedish presidency of the EU is coming up, which could be a very pro-transparency presidency. We also have the stars aligning somewhat with a new government taking office in Germany. So I wonder, do you see this as sort of third time lucky, in a sense, for a legislative proposal from the Commission to revise the regulation?
I would say as soon as possible. Of course, it cannot be overnight, and the Commission has to work on it, but we know quite well what we want and what we need to have in the legislation, what are the outdated parts of the current one. Well, 1049 works. And the Commission is working with it. We are also accepting the case law in spite of some of the findings of the Ombudsman, but we all know that simply the time is ripe for upgrading the rules. So as soon as possible means for me that we still have next year It's the third year of this mandate to propose something which might have a chance to be adopted by the end of the mandate, which is my ambition. You can imagine I am not here forever, fortunately. And there is still Czech presidency before the Swedish. I'm going to Prague soon, hopefully.
You might have some. You might have some influence.
We have a new government, which I don't have a clue whether they will have this as a priority, but I will try. And but the first thing is to take that technical step. Technical, maybe it's not the right word, but to enable us to withdraw the old legislation. And I don't remember, and I have some good institutional memory already after 7 years, I don't remember such situation. We have some pieces of legislation which have been blocked, but the Commission is still pushing on adoption because we are convinced that the legislation is still fit for purpose, but it's not this case.
So, thank you. Mr. Kempinen, you sounded a more cautious note, saying that any new legislation or moves in that direction would need to be looked at. How cautious are you?
Well, as cautious a Director General with non-political responsibilities should be, I hope. I mean, I notice in the list of the participants in the room, there are many of my delegates as well, and I'm sure that they will tell me when I overstep my mark. Not here today, I hope, but afterwards. But nevertheless, I think that having had many discussions with them, you would struggle to find member states or governments of the member states who have a difficulty in looking at what a better proposal or regulation would look like. Why would they? Because this is a very difficult situation for all of us, and it has over the years become increasingly difficult. And it's difficult administratively, that the burden of administration that goes into looking into some of the applications for documents that are done with sincere interest but are not very specified is not really working in the interest of the applicants themselves, because it can lead to administrative delays that nobody really wants either. The current situation, as I said, the lines are being blurred because of technology, but also because in the area of non-legislative work, where the negotiation to an extent has to be protected better than maybe in the legislative work, it is becoming more difficult as well. So I'm not cautious in the sense that we would be in any way against. I don't think that the Council is any way against that, looking at if the Commission would come with a new proposal. I'm sure that it would be, as an idea, even welcomed. But of course, the rest depends on what it would look like. And as I was saying, I can only repeat the point. It's immensely important, in my experience, that enough time is dedicated to informal discussions. I'm sorry to say there will not be necessary public discussions between the parties concerned, so that the Commission can get its proposal right and not get stuck in the first 100 yards or meters.
So, Ms. Hautala, you've heard the willingness for a new legislative proposal to be tabled with the ambition of having it go onto the legislative books perhaps as soon as the end of the term, or at least make quite a bit of progress. But that also rests on the European Parliament moving. How do you assess the chances there?
Well, listening to the other speakers in this panel, I make the note that, in fact, just now the European Parliament is preparing one of its annual reports on, the access to documents on 1049, and maybe this is an opportunity for the Parliament to come up with a few key proposals for a review. So that's just for you to know that, and as the Parliament is relatively open, so you just need to look at what's happening in the 2 or 3 committees at stake. So I think that might be indeed, but it seems to me that there needs to be a kind of a big public consultation even before the Commission comes up with anything. And as Alan Rusas, the long-time Finnish judge in the European Court of Justice, said the other day, the Commission proposals are not created in the heads of Commission officials, but they reflect the needs of the society. And
I mean, we have wonderful operators in the field, and I think it would be totally necessary to hear them. I'm looking at Helen Derbyshire, for instance. So there's a real school of practice and helping people to use that right. So why not pool forces and organize something very, let's say, open? I would say open. I stress open.
Thank you. And Ombudsman, if I could turn to you, given the significance of what we've just heard. I mean, on the one hand, we hear the need for public consultation, right? We hear a note of caution about how all of this will be done. On the other hand, reflecting a little bit my opening remarks and what you've said and what the survey shows, there's an urgency here that is linked to the credibility of the European project.
I mean, how much time do people need, you know? 2005 was when the Commission first started working on this, then 2008, 2011, then the Parliament, and the Council has yet to show its hand. So I think citizens might consider that, in a way, Parliament and the Commission are acting with one hand tied behind their backs if they're not able to see what the Council is thinking in relation to that. So the Commission, maybe the Parliament will say, okay, Commission put forward another proposal, but without the Council or the Commission having a clear understanding of what's likely to fly with the Council, then is that more wasted time? So I think that, you know, to my mind, things change where there is ambition and where there is will. And where people don't just look at the obstacles, but look at the far horizon and see what might be achieved. And at the beginning, when I came into office in 2013 and was thinking about my strategy and what I would concentrate on, I actually did agree with my colleagues that we would not use up too many resources in pushing for a change or suggesting a change in Regulation 1049. Why? Because we didn't judge that there was sufficient political will generally to do it. So I think as well, when stress is alleviated in people, when people are honest with them, people can accept bad news or understand where difficulties are if people are open with them. If people say, look, these are the problems and so on. And that's what I think perhaps is missing in this, you know, that real openness and honesty in relation to telling people why this hasn't moved along. And just, I mean, I agree with Madam Hautala there in relation to a wider debate, because things have changed so dramatically since, you know, 2001. I mean, the children who were born then are now 20, and look at the incredible transformational changes in their lives and the way they communicate, the way they transmit information, and the way they expect information to be got. But there was just this morning, briefly, a quote from and this speaks to what Madam Hautala was saying, and this is from Joanna Mendes, who's a professor of comparative administrative law at the University of Luxembourg, and she was reflecting on 1049. And she says, in particular, at a time in which the terms of the debate on transparency are changing under the pressure of ever more available information, of the concerns for privacy, and of the very way procedures are conducted via new technologies, a reflection on the meaning of transparency, its limits, usages, and political effects in the EU is essential to define both possible and needed reforms, but also which public measures may be needed to realise the abstract ideals that it stands for.
Thank you. And I would actually like to pick up on that right away. Vice President Jourova, I guess I would put it this way. If you were to come forward with a fully fledged legislative proposal, I mean, to what degree do you think that would enable the EU to manage some of the really big issues in access to documents that we're currently facing? First, the status of electronic messages, of instant messages. Many of us will have read Marcus Becker's story in Der Spiegel just a couple days ago about the mass deletions of and the seemingly arbitrary management of texts and emails from Commission President von der Leyen about vaccine contract negotiations. These are messages that some experts say should be subject to general registration unless actively moved to a private folder. Now, I know that the institutions like to say that instant messages don't endure, but the decisions taken as a result of them most certainly do seem to endure. So my question, Vice President, why is mass deletion of messages happening to some degree on your watch, and would a legislative proposal go some way towards addressing that?
Yeah, this is exactly what I said before, that we inevitably have to reflect that the way of communication is changing. I don't believe that even Ursula von der Leyen, or I don't remember myself, to take a decision through the text message, which should be set in stone. Yeah, it's always some kind of short-term communication with somebody, but it can happen that more and more these ways of communication will bring the decisions which will have to be published. Yeah, I can imagine. So this is one of the things we want to reflect. You are a little bit now focusing on the legislation, and I know I invited you to this, to this option A, but I would say that the more probable is option B, that the Commission will now work, or we already started to work on the internal rules, which will also become the reflection of these new ways of communication. I spoke about it already when COVID-19 started, when we started to communicate through the pipes, through the electronic means. I asked the colleagues to compare the new way of communicating with the rules we have for access to documents, because suddenly I realized, so where are we now? We are speaking with somebody, but it's more connected with the transparency register than access to document. Yeah, but anyway, you realize that something crucial is changing. The way you're communicating is changing. So for the guidelines, internal guidelines, I believe that this will be the step one, which will come, where we can do it without the co-legislators. But we do not want to do even this without the co-legislators. So here I confirm what Madam Hautala said, and also a colleague from the Council who has a difficult name to pronounce. Okay. That it should be done in consultation, because definitely we will want the co-legislators to follow, to jump on the boat as well. And I believe that the Commission should do the work now and to be the pioneer and to prepare, to create the guidelines which might serve as a pattern for the new possible legislation which will be acceptable for all three institutions. We have good tradition. A transparency register was done exactly like that. Now recently this was a legislation, but I will propose now the package on European political parties. There was a permanent consultation with the political bodies before we adopted the legislation, or we will adopt it at the Commission level. So this is my promise I can give you today, that it will not be just the Commission for itself. It will be done for the Commission for the moment, with the view of offering it for use for the other two institutions, and later for all institutions which might be covered by the new legislation. If you still let me finalize. When preparing these guidelines for the Commission, inevitably we have to consult with the two others, because we will have to tackle with the issue of the documents under the trialogue era, which is about the mutual trust between the co-legislators. So we cannot just somewhere go to another planet and say we will be absolutely transparent and we will publish every document at every moment of the negotiations, because it is about ability to work, ability to negotiate. This is what you meant by what should be protected. Let's be honest, I want to protect, first of all, the right of people for information, but also there is something to protect on our side. And this is exactly this efficiency of work, the efficiency of negotiation. So we will have to consult, and we will have to also have some green light for the other institutions who are pretty much dependent on how the Commission behaves. Yeah, when you look into the kitchen. Can I still say two more things?
Of course.
I remember the Finnish presidency, how hard time they had to convince the Council to go one step forward, and it didn't work. I remember the minutes from Corepers that said, yes, we understand this is necessary, but we cannot do it for the sake of the efficiency of the negotiations. And these were several member states which were really very stressed about going that one extra mile.
Thank you. Ms. Hautala, I think you wanted to jump in here, and I would ask you to frame what you're going to say a little bit in light of the weaker Plan B that has been put forward, as well as the more promising Plan A, which is to come forward with the legislative proposal.
You're reading my thoughts, James. On these upgraded guidelines, yes and no, because I believe that if the Commission does it alone, it doesn't serve the purpose that you mentioned, Vice President Jourova. For instance, the access to the trilogue 4-column documents is already an interinstitutional issue, and I'm aware of the efforts that have been done there, and I'm not quite sure we are there in practice yet where we should be in the line of the De Capitani versus Parliament judgment. But couldn't you think of, let's say, combining 1 and 2, like stepwise? Yes, that such upgraded guidelines could as well be a kind of a working document from the Commission on a possible, towards a possible review of the regulation. So I mean, to already to let's say acknowledge that there probably would, yeah. And then on the minutes of the Coreper and of the Council working groups. We still have the issue, I think, and Reijo, I'm very open to be counteracted here, but it seems to me that the Council still behaves as a diplomatic body. And this is what we know from the Access Info case, that the court said that, look, it's ridiculous to believe that the Council and the Member States would not have space to continue to revise their positions towards a certain legislative proposal by the Commission. So there's no case for not disclosing the positions of the Member States when they discuss legislative initiatives. So yes, there's also, I mean, we have this issue that there are court rulings which are not implemented. So that has to be an essential part of the review of the regulation. Otherwise, I think we will we really risk how do you say, like step back, several steps back.
Thank you. And Mr. Kempinen, I mean, originally we were talking about electronic messages, so perhaps you could touch on that too. But the case of Emilio De Capitani has come up, and the issue of the transparency of the Council has been invoked. And, you know, forgive me if I'm, you know, going too far here, but when it comes to the Council, if I could just reinforce a little bit of what has been said, I think the big issue is that the Member States have positions that are not recorded, and no recording means no documents, and that means there's fewer ways, if any ways at all, for citizens to hold their governments to account at the EU level. Over to you.
Well, thank you, James. No need to apologize. I mean, I don't think that the institutions by themselves are easily offended, if at all. It's a conceptual impossibility. But in any case, if I try to answer these couple of points that were raised here, I mean, first on the issue of Access Info. Now, Access Info is over 15 years old. It has been followed up by numerous cases of the court, including De Capitani. And I think that the De Capitani, in my personal view, that judgment took us as far on the legislative transparency as we currently can be. There are issues of implementation. Of course there is, because the implementation is a provision that is independent within the Parliament and in the Council, and things are done in a different way, and it should not be a competition. That's what I also meant, that there should be a more cooperation between the institutions so that we have a more harmonious and consistent approach in the level of implementation, so as to avoid a kind of a forum shopping, for example, that is not necessarily in the interest of anybody. Mm-hmm. On the issues that Mrs. O'Reilly raised, I would just briefly say that I mean, first of all, if you look at the statistics that the Ombudsman's Office released on the access to documents requests and the number of positive replies in the Council is referred to only the initial phase and not the confirmative phase, that further improves our statistics. Of course, you can argue that anything below 100% is not good, but 100% is not reality either. I think that the numbers that we have are quite respectable and the improvement has been quite good as well. So in a way, the Council views are reflected in the practice that we have put in place year on year. And secondly, a reference made to the latest Finnish presidency. Undoubtedly, there will be many more because I don't think that we ever see fix it. But the Finnish presidency effort led to a result during the German presidency that has again led to a further pledge and increase in transparency on the Council side. On other things that we could do, well, I would be slightly hesitant in that respect, in particular if we now reach an informal kind of understanding that there might be a need to revisit the current legislation before we jump into much further doing more work on the current one. Now, on the technology, just final point. Access to documents is a specific concept. And of course, the document in itself was derived from the era when everything was analog and on paper. And then now almost nothing is. We have offices that are free of paper, miraculously mine one of them. Now, when everything becomes just content and then you discuss how do you define a document and you say that every piece of content is a document. You cannot ignore this ever-changing terminology either. You talk about SMS, you talk about tweets, or you talk about text messages. Well, I know people who today, there might be some in the room who find this discussion a bit boring and are playing Minecraft. And when they're playing Minecraft, they're interacting with other people and they're messaging there and might be even changing documents within that space. What do we call it? How do you protect that environment? How do you open up that environment? So it is a complex issue that is not only linked to access to documents, where many of the issues that we touched upon today really carefully has to be thought about before we jump into the next phase.
Great. So before we open up for questions, I just think we should give the Ombudsman a chance to respond to some of the issues that have been raised.
Thanks, James. Well, I think it's very good to hear Madam Jourova coming forward with even the Plan B proposals and her willingness indeed to do Plan A, and to hear Madam Hautala suggest that the Plan B might be a working document on which both of the institutions and perhaps the Council in time might continue to work on, and it's progress, and that's always good. In relation to the headline or top line figures for document release from the institutions, that they appear high. I mean, the 80s and the 90s, but it's not full release. I think in the Commission's term, in relation to the Commission, I think it's 50% are fully released and 50% are partially released. And from our experience, a lot of what is partially released can be innocuous stuff, you know, maybe a press release that somebody sent or a line from a letter, you know, that has no substantive value in relation to whatever the individual might be looking for. So unless you actually drill down into those figures and see what isn't released and what are the big issues that remain sort of contested, then the headline figures don't really tell the full story. In relation to the Access Info Europe case, is one that I frequently referred to, that it seemed as if the ECJ had sorted it by saying, yes, you know, the member state positions are legislative documents, they should be released. But of course, we have access to documents under Regulation 1049. We don't have access to information. So if the positions of the member states are not recorded, which we found in our investigation, of a few years ago, they aren't recorded, and then there's no document, and so there's no release. So that's one way of getting around it. And also just talking about what important cases, what important documents are not released, you know, as I say, when you look past the headline figures. I mean, 2 cases, and I know my colleagues are sick of me talking about one of them, which is the bees case, as we call it. Advice that was given by the Commission to the Council in relation to pesticides and bees back in 2013. And the Council position still hasn't seen the light of day. When a French NGO, Paulinus, sought to get member state positions in relation to that so they could exercise their right to influence or to take part in the democratic life of the Union, the Commission, who chaired the comitology group, said that they denied the release of the documents on the grounds that there was a greater public interest in protecting the deliberative process than there was in the public interest of people knowing what was happening in relation to member states' use of pesticides, biodiversity, bees, and so on. Now, I absolutely agree with the Council. I mean, an FOI Act or a Transparency Act is not there to do harm, and there are certain interests that need to be protected, including the deliberative process. Deliberating for 6 months, a year, even 2 years is okay, but deliberating, as it is now, for 8 years is really, not really rational. The other case that we dealt with, and again, where we got a firm no, was in relation to I think another civil society actor who was looking for details of the fishing quotas because they wanted to know the scientific basis for decisions around the fishing quotas, and again that was denied. So there are very important pieces of information that are not coming out, and I think sometimes that can be hidden behind the headline figures of access.
Thank you all, and we're going to move to questions shortly, but I would just say, Commissioner Vice President Jourova, on Plan B, I mean, there's a lot to talk about there, and one obvious question, I think, is, what is the leverage that the Commission would actually have to get the other institutions to adopt the kind of updates that you're talking about? I mean, it's great to lead by example, but when it comes to what journalists need and what civil society actors need, they just need the stuff, right? And the sooner that can be done, the better from our side. Now, I will, as I say, open up to questions. And what I didn't have a chance to sort of get to in our discussion on the panel here, but I would encourage it from the audience, would be seeing some of these issues through the lens of the recovery and the resilience funds, for instance, the vast amounts of money that are flowing that we don't fully understand necessarily where they're going. We've also had major issues with the availability of the vaccine contracts, and vaccines, of course, being such a fundamental part not only of public health, but of public trust in the European project. So I shall ask for a show of hands from the floor for how many people have questions in mind. Could I get a broad showing of hands so I can get a sense of how many people might have questions? Okay, terrific. First question from the floor to, I think, Marcus Becker from Der Spiegel in a mask. Is there a microphone that will? Oh no, you're to grab the one in your chair. It should be just under the armrest.
Links.
Transparency.
I'm sure that I'm sure they haven't tried to hide the mic.
They should have given me a manual first. Right. So my question is for Vice President Jourova. You said that in text messages, not everything is set in stone and not too important. But then I would venture to guess that the same is true for the majority of emails handled by the Commission. They are not all of them are of earth-shattering importance. Still, you do not throw away all of them, but you keep a large part because they might be important or are important for the Commission's activities. And so my question is, why why don't you change your internal rules quickly just to make sure that you at least archive and keep a hold on instant messages which might be important, even though you revise your position later, just to be able to keep them afterwards, because obviously many players, not only journalists, but maybe even judges or historians, are not only interested in the final result of decisions, but also how they came to pass. So why don't you just unilaterally change your internal rules to reflect that many instant messages, WhatsApp or phone messages, are kept? Thank you.
Yes, also for the sake of our protection, by the way. Yeah, because sometimes it can happen that you receive a text message which you realize you cannot leave it for yourself. Yeah, because there is something which might endanger your work or your credibility. Yeah? We live in a very tense era. By the way, whenever I reply to Mark's questions, I am prohibited to enter some countries. So that's the journalist from Spiegel. So I hope if I answer now, I will not be prohibited to enter the Commission. But on your question, as I said, we have to bear in mind that this is becoming a very important way of communicating things, even the important ones. I would insist on the statement that the text messages do not create the final decisions. Yeah, that this is an auxiliary kind of communication. But we have to take it into consideration. We have to take the examples and reflect the current practice and do two things. To define which kind of messages, how to define it, it won't be easy, but which kind of messages deserve the qualification of a document which should be registered. It's one thing. And the other thing, the technological solution, how to transfer the messages into the archives. Yeah, we are working on both.
I mean, that raises a fascinating question, doesn't it, about the capacity of the institutions, not only to manage the document systems that we started talking about when the regulation was drafted, but the management and capacity for these messages and this type of communication in the future. And, you know, a question in that regard might be to each of the institutions here, you know, how much are you spending on this kind of capacity to manage 1049? And what is the size of the team that you have dealing with this? And how urgent is it for you to build that up, to literally have more people dealing with these requests and the registration process? I'll give that to Mr. Kempinen first.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think the Commission probably, as well as the Parliament, would agree that when it comes to the most difficult applications for documents today, not necessarily by their content, but how to examine such content on its own merits, are the ones that concern every possible means of communication, platform, whatever has been used to get that content across. And the difficulty therein is, how do you know? Because part of the problem that you have, that unless we have systems that are compatible with each other, that are based on really thorough, systematic and organized registration, that deals with and covers all essential work that we do, it is impossible to manage all that content. And at the moment, the technology is running really fast, and people are using different kinds of means of communicating with each other. Now, adding more people to the task, I don't think that is either humanely or financially or administratively possible to the extent that that would be the solution. You can always add more people, but how many people is enough? The answer has to lie in somewhere else. And it would not be entirely in line with the good administrative practice, which is one of the great things that the Ombudsman's office has also advocated and got all the institutions to agree with, where it is the officials themselves that carry the responsibility for the content that passes by their hands or what they hold or create. You cannot solve these issues within an administration by creating an entity to which it's delegated to and then growing that entity. The answer has to be different.
Okay, so I mean, I'm not sure how many people you have working on this right now, but I would just say that...
We have roughly 25 in the unit that...
25, okay. And I mean, I guess I would put this in the context of Europe having nearly landed a space probe on a moving asteroid. So I presume that this is the kind of thing that the institutions could probably sort out. Ms. Hautala, let me pass over to you, but let me frame my question a little bit in terms of, and I think it's only fair because we've had a go at the other two institutions, the Bureau.
Yes.
Which is part of the way the European Parliament is managed. There are many, many complaints about it. I have been an unhappy customer when it comes to the Bureau. How many people do you think, or do you know that the Parliament has working on this, fielding requests? And how do you see the registration of electronic messages and the capacity to do this efficiently being best managed in the future?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I wanted to say that now that I've made some remarks about the Council, which sort of belongs to my role and which is, I think, completely appropriate, and I've tended to give some advice to the Commission. Now, I have to say that the European Parliament does not have this internal culture of transparency that Vera Jourova is calling for in its administration. There's a striking imbalance between the Parliament as a political agent for transparency and as an administrative entity. And nowhere is this more visible than in the 15-strong Bureau of the European Parliament. And I couldn't tell you how many people are dealing with the applications, but it's nothing to boast about that 93% of the applications are positive, because the remaining 7% include some really sensitive ones, which I think the Parliament could deal with a more, let's say, citizen-friendly and journalist-friendly way. The Parliament's Bureau is rubber stamping proposals from the administration, which very often revert to the argument that publishing those documents would endanger the decision-making of the institution. And I think this is one of the most problematic exemptions in Article 4 of the regulation. And I'm permanently thinking about how we could change the Parliament's administrative culture to be a bit more open-minded, citizen-friendly. Can I give you an example? There's quite a havoc about the need to present a COVID certificate in the buildings of the Parliament now. And I don't think it was very helpful that very, very limited number of people are aware of the opinion of the legal service of our institution on the, let's say, the validity and the legality of this measure. I think it's a pity that sometimes, it could have given, for instance, the argument that we have a state treaty with France, Luxembourg and Belgium, which states that the Parliament does not necessarily have to follow national rules on this type of issues. It could have helped, if that could have been public, but I think it's for instance, the legal service opinions, sometimes I think they would really serve the purpose of public need to know. So.
Thank you. And Vice President Jourova, just for sake of public knowledge, I mean, what's the size of the team that's working on this? And should you move forward with either Plan A or Plan B, by what multiple will it grow?
So how many? 2,534? I don't know. I really don't know at this moment. But I have my colleagues from the Commission for the next panel. Could you please look into that? Not now, but you will speak later. I would like to have a more general comment. We should make sure that we need less people to do that. And the way to need less people to do bigger job is to go proactively out with the documents and to use in full the technologies. And I don't want to say that it should be done by artificial intelligence. Yeah? We are still people working for the people in the institution and for the citizens. But we should really look into what the technologies are enabling, including the transferring of the important text messages into the documents which will be published. So these are the things we have, and we are looking into that. And the system to proactively publish everything where there are no exceptions, and according to the current legislation, everything is public. Yeah, unless. So we should be able to use the technologies to do that. For the text messages, still, I can tell you, I remember, I have freshly in my memory the trialogues. We were sitting around the table, and there were some co-negotiators who had constantly on the phone somebody. Do you want who it was? Trade unions were sitting with us around the table, literally. Yeah, because they were advising how to negotiate. And nobody knows what was the advice. Of course, I heard what was the advice because I had to face the new situation and the negotiation, which came from somebody from outside. Is this the transparent way, or is this the way which increases the trust of the three co-legislators when you have a friend on the phone? So I mean, either we will continue this practice or we will make these contributions which influence the final result of the legislative process simply public. Yeah, and these are the things which I had in mind, that if the Commission will come with the guidelines, we will have to consult with the co-legislators, because it also will affect their work, even though the step one will be the internal commission guideline. And the last comment, more general. You know, now the Conference on the Future of Europe is up and running. For me, it's extremely useful to shut up and to listen to what the people are saying. And many say, we want to see the Commission or the EU, but they mean the Commission in most of the cases, as the modern open office, professional modern open office. And I would really like to go for this, to fulfill this demand. The other problem is, and this is what we are not discussing here today, that we publish the documents which the people will understand. Oh my God, I can tell you, this is where we have a huge gap. And if we can in the future use the technologies or some new way of transferring what we are adopting into how it affects Mr. Smith. No, Smith left the EU, no? Mrs. Hautala, not this one, or Mr. Vomáčka in Czech Republic, this will be great, because the people do not understand the language, the jargon, the abbreviations. So, but it's another story, isn't it?
Thank you, Vice President. Now I'm going to hand over to Ms. Hautala because she wanted to come in, but I'm also going to put a question to her as well, because something has come in from online that I wanted to pass on. It's from Harold Schumann, a journalist. He writes in to say, I would like to repeat the moderator's question, because Ms. Hautala, you did not answer. Why exactly did the European Parliament block the European Commission in withdrawing the old proposals or the previous proposals? So I'll let you answer that question, and perhaps you could take whatever else you were going to say into
thanks.
that.
My understanding is that the Parliament wanted to have a review, but maybe a more thorough review. So that's probably what happened. Somebody may know better. On what Vera Jourova has said about the need to listen to people, there's one thing that would make it greatly easier for citizens and other entities to follow and interact with European institutions, all of them, would be finally if the Commission would be a little more positive about the European Parliament's legislative proposal from the previous legislature on what we call open, efficient and independent European administration. And the Ombudsman has traditionally been an ardent supporter of this proposal. By the way, it also would state that the institutions have the duty to keep record of decisions. So, you know, I'm kind of puzzled because for many years we have heard that the Commission still needs to be convinced, and it has its own code of conduct of good administrative behavior. But I think it would be very important for all the entities, all the subjects, if they could be somehow, let's say, a minimum set of administrative rules which are common to all institutions. And this, actually, my best friends in this effort have been businesses, because they find it's very cumbersome to deal with the 40+ agencies, offices, institutions that we now have. They all have slightly different internal rules. So I think we have this question that transparency also needs to be looked at the level of do we really have a modern, good administration? And I think the European Union has matured into a stage where it really needs to do that. I mean, states do have laws on administrative procedures, so why not the European Union? It's not about administration of the member states, it's about our own institutions, agencies, offices, and so on.
Thank you. And I would, do we have any more questions from the audience here, burning questions? I'm looking around for hands. Okay. A lot of the questions that were asked online have actually been answered. So I'm going to try and combine one last question that I've just seen online with a question that's very much on my mind. And it is about the recovery and resilience funds, which, let's remember, it's about delivering €750 billion of EU state and taxpayer money to help our states and societies and economies deal with the coronavirus pandemic. Naturally, there's a big public interest in where the loans and the grants are going, and knowing the degree to which the money is really going to help out with the digital transition and with the climate emergency, which again is part of what this money is supposed to do. So these aren't idle questions. And I would put this to Commissioner Jourova, Vice President Jourova, if I may. In this age of heightened transparency, why didn't we go as far as to push member states to give Brussels the complete picture of where that money is going? And I would also, after Vice President, you've had a go at that one, I would put it to Mr. Kempinen to give the member state perspective on that.
There is a big pressure on the member states, also reflected in sometimes very burdensome negotiations, that there will be the same rules as for this money as for the cohesion policy, for instance, or some other traditional fund flows. And the conditions are clear that there is a publicly accessible monitoring system where everybody can look into the system and see who is getting the money, how much, and what are the deadlines, and so on. So I'm sure that the negotiators are pushing on having a similar system for the public, for the informing of the public. What was the second question?
Well, I'm going to pass on to Mr. Kempinen, if I may, on that one. I mean,
but this is absolutely crucial that the people know what we do with this money. And for instance, for digitalization, which is minimum 20% of the whole package, there is a very strict monitoring system which pushes the member states to report back to the Commission what they are doing with this money. and a similar system for the green policies, which amount around 37%. So this is under big time pressure. The investments have to be finished by 26. There is no chance to redirect the money. So now or never, take it or leave it. And that's why also the Commission is rather strict on two things: to have these big amounts consulted with the stakeholders within the country. And we have received a lot of complaints from regions, from municipalities, from NGOs, from many member states that they have not been properly consulted. And the second thing, that there is transparency on how the money is distributed.
So if I can just wrap up the questions here with you, Mr. Kemppainen. I mean, as a former journalist, you will appreciate, and this relates to one of the questions that came in online, that in the absence of the ability to even find out where money is going in the case of some of these member states, we have a problem there, which is not dissimilar from the problem that a lot of journalists and a lot of civil society actors encounter when they deal with the council, is that so many national positions are secret. And again, I would just underline that there's this sense that journalists and those of us in civil society who are meant to be keeping our eyes on what's going on there, we don't even really have the ability to do that. Can I just get your
Well, I'd like to actually answer both questions in here, and maybe the first part of the answer is more brief. As a former journalist talking to a journalist whom I know exactly where the counter positions are, and who has never had any difficulty in finding out. But there was an obligation already then to the states, to the local actors receiving that money, to also confess publicly who gave that money. So you could drive on the roads and the highways across Europe, you'll see the signs that this is built with the European Union. Now most of the recovery is virtual, digital. Where do you put those stickers? Not that everybody ever wanted to do that either. But there is a big issue here. And that, I think that all institutions owe it to themselves to improve it by way of cooperation a lot, and I mean a lot. So that your answer to the question, what is happening with EU money, what is EU doing near me, would be answer to. That you can say, where did that money go? What did it give you? Where is it, what is it invested? How is it invested? And here, I'm sure that we have not done anywhere nearly enough. Again, the reasons behind that, we all know how complicated that is, the competencies, the differences. The Commission is not the implementing body, it is managing, etc., etc. But I still think that there's a lot of room for progress that could be done with a little bit of good field and a lot of effort. Agreed with you, Reo, that a lot of people have the ability to find out that information, but not everyone. And what we're often talking about here, like it or not, is perception. Are the institutions perceived to be open and transparent? Now, so I would just sort of add that note. Can I just turn back the tables finally on this? Because if you look at the structure of the people who constitute the applicants for the documents, for example, in the Council or in the Commission, most of those people do have the means also of finding information. Now, we're at the end of our time, and I would like to hand it over to the European Ombudsman to wrap up our session.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you to the panelists. My hope for this session was that things would move on a little bit, and I retain that hope, particularly having listened to Madam Jourova and Madam Hautala, and the Council. I'm still not quite sure where it's at, to be honest, but anyway, hopefully that there will be ambition in relation to this, and where there is political will and energy, I think a way will be found. Could I just say briefly in relation to the recovery funds, I think transparency has to be the EU's friend in relation to this, has to be the institution's friend in relation to this. And it's one thing for a trained researcher, which most journalists are, and I was once one myself, to be able to access information on the Council website or wherever. It's quite another for an ordinary citizen to do that, and I think we all have to acknowledge that. And who are we talking about, really, and who are we talking for? It's citizens. So if I was in my own country, Ireland, and I want to know how much money did we get, how is it being spent, where is it going, what's the rationale and all of that. I want to be easily able to access that information. And if I have a problem with it, and I think if it's been spent inappropriately, I need to be able to feed back.
We're up against the clock, so I'm going to kick it off right away with our second panel for the EU Ombudsman's Conference on Access to EU Documents, What Next? Again, just to repeat, this is an expert panel that will delve into some of the practical issues experienced by people who are requesting access to EU documents. And as we've seen from the survey carried out by the Ombudsman, there are regular resources in the Secretariat General of the European Commission, and she's previously worked at DG Competition for the Commission on financial services, and before that, in private sector with Deutsche Börse in Frankfurt. And we have Rosita Hickey, to Tanya's right, who works with the European Ombudsman as Director of Inquiries, and she handles cases, including conducting inquiries into possible cases of EU maladministration. Now, after our panel this morning, can I just ask for some very rapid initial responses to what was said in our decision makers panel? And I'd like to ask that, though, against the backdrop of how making it easier to request information and making it easier to find information could be of benefit for the European project at this delicate political moment for the future of democracy and the rule of law. And I'd like to, as we did with the previous panel, kick things off with just a minute or two each, which I'll hold you to. Helen.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks to Emily, the Ombudsman, for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be back in Brussels and my first international in-person event since the pandemic started. Why is this important? That's your question, right? Why are we doing this? Why do we need to be having this conversation? Because transparency, and I love the quote about rethinking transparency, because we need to recognize this isn't technical access to documents that we're talking about. This is about the information that citizens across Europe need in order to understand the EU and for what the EU does to be appreciated and to be legitimate. The EU spent in the last period, I've got the number here, 187 billion on the Europe for Citizens Fund to help people understand the EU and to participate better in its decision making. That cannot be done without information. But I know, because in Access Info we work day in and out helping people, from the journalists who are the specialist users of access to information, but also citizens trying to get information from the European Union institutions, the bodies and the agencies. And it's really difficult. You didn't get an answer to your question about exactly how much is being spent on transparency. But I suspect that it's way out of balance with that 187 billion. So I think one of the first things we need to be looking at is what are we doing, how much are we really investing to ensure that the transparency systems work? I think the previous speakers mentioned the importance of the proactive transparency in language that's understandable for citizens. But we really have a significant problem there. And if in the Ombudsman survey we had 2/3 of people being either dissatisfied or highly dissatisfied with their treatment, and they're the specialists who, as the gentleman from the council said, know how to get information, what about the rest of the European citizenry? We have a problem there, and we need to be talking in the context of addressing that problem.
Thank you. And Peter, responses to the VIP panel, any thoughts on why now, revisions to 1049?
Sure. So yeah, it's nice to be back. I've been away for about 2.5 years. I left Brussels and now I'm back in the Netherlands. And for one, it's great to see that the good old Brussels bubble panel of gray, white old men, you know, is changing slightly. At least we've got the age and the gender balance a lot better. But another thing that I noticed, which I'd forgotten a little bit, was the instant reflex to legislate when there's a problem, right? We have a legislation, but it's not working properly. So what do we do in the Brussels bubble? We change the regulation. But I'm not sure if that's the immediate answer to the problems. Because if you look at the legislation and how it's implemented, already you see so many different interpretations, not just between the institutions, but within the institutions. I can tell you about experiences I've had differing from DG to DG, even within the Commission. And there are even cases where I asked for a particular type of document one time and I got it, and the next time, same type of document, I didn't get it or with great delays. So sure, you can look at the legislation, but that's not going to solve the problem. It's what the institutions do with it. And from what the panelists said in the previous panel, I heard some promises, but nothing really concrete and nothing to convince me that we're going to a golden age of transparency in the next coming months and years.
Thank you, Peter. Päivi, from an academic perspective, we're all curious to know what you make of what you've heard and why now if we need revisions to 1049.
Thank you. I must say, I'm actually listening to this discussion as also someone who's been involved in trying to reform the regulation. I represented the Finnish government in council negotiations between 2008 and 2013. So I also have that experience that reform necessarily does not mean that we're going for something very good. And I think the lesson there learned is also that in order to be successful, we would need to have a commission that is very strongly committed to promoting transparency. And I must say, the experiences that we have, very recent ones from reforming the Aarhus regulation, are not very encouraging in that respect. I mean, we could have seen much more push towards greater transparency there than we actually saw. So I'm very hesitant. But this regulation, it has clearly legal problems, problems of legal design, outdated provisions, but it also has a massive amount of provisions that are not being applied properly. And I very much agree with much of that has already been said, but I think there are 3 issues that I would still want to add, just very briefly. The question of prohibitive costs, which is a very big theme. Question of how much does it cost to litigate in this area. I say this as someone who's brought 2 cases before the court. We've got experiences now with NGOs being charged massive litigation costs, which means that they will not appeal, and that means bad institutional practices will go unaddressed, unchallenged in the court. There's a question of broad applications, which is a new theme, and the third one is the question relating to leaks and sort of very unequal playing field in the sense that information is informally in circulation in Brussels, but you cannot get your hands on it through formal channels, and that, I think, is the third problem.
Thanks so much. And Tanya, I'm sorry, you were put rather on the spot by the question about the capacity and what is being spent and the size of the team. Either answer that now or later. But again, your responses to what you've heard so far this morning.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Well, first of all, as already mentioned by Vice President Jourova, I also would like to say that the Commission very much welcomes the initiatives of the Ombudsman to hold this conference. and to discuss this topic, because indeed is a very important issue now, and it's a good opportunity. So thank you very much for that. And as you know, this year we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of the 1049, so of 2001. So obviously this is also another reason to discuss it more proactively. So my reaction, few reactions, is that the transparency overall, it's a very important issue, of course, and it's something that is growing, and clearly citizens want to be informed citizens, and we really need to engage with citizens and make sure that we as institutions are modern and transparent. But transparency, today we are focusing on access to documents part, but transparency is of course a much wider topic, as was of course touched upon by several speakers. We, for example, as a Commission, we see transparency is very important, is one of the priorities of von der Leyen Commission, and you can see the fact that Vera Jourova, our Vice President, there is a transparency in her mandate, in her title as well. It's also a very important sign of our commitment to broaden the transparency overall. But so we see under transparency a lot of aspects. For example, you know that we relatively recently concluded a very successful negotiation with the Council and the European Parliament on the upgrading the transparency register and having 3 institutions now working together on that. I think it was a very big success, and really very much under Vice President Jourova that this push to finalize these negotiations that were also very difficult and protracted actually finalized. And this is also a big element because of the overall transparency. We have our work with lobby. Who are the lobbyists, you know, which interests they represent, with whom do they meet, publication of meetings, for example, of our decision makers is a very important aspect. And it should not be overlooked, you know, focusing only on access to documents. I mean, also when we speak about more specifically about access to documents, that, I mean, some statistics were mentioned, of course, already. We do receive a lot of requests. There are more than 8,000 requests of initial requests per year, plus additional 300 plus for the confirmatory requests. We release a lot of documents. Our accounts show 80% of full release or partial release, plus another 40% later on in a confirmatory stage. So it's very important. We have a very large team overall working on the access to documents in the Commission. Formally or informally, we have around 15 people in a unit that deals with confirmatory requests and with a policy overall, transparency policy and access to document policy in the Commission. But then we have a lot of people in the DGs, usually 1 or 2 people who are formally assigned to deal with access to documents, to coordinate this. If you multiply it all together, we estimate that more than 100 people are...
Brilliant. Okay, that's extremely helpful.
Topic,
and we'll come back to those other points, but thank you very much for helping answer that question. And what Tanya was saying there, Rosita, was that Vice President Jourova has a very strong track record in pushing forward on transparency. And so Tanya, I think, was trying to buoy our spirits a little bit, that there would indeed be progress. So, I mean, one of the things that the Vice President talked about was indeed coming forward, if possible, with a legislative proposal by the end of her term. That's what you will have heard too, and how optimistic are you now about that happening?
I think we're all really pleased to hear what was voiced, but I think it would be really important now to follow up. I think for the Ombudsman, as the Ombudsman said, in the early days it was something that the office decided not to focus on, but now the momentum could well be there. It is important that the various institutions show their hands, but in the meantime there's quite some work to be done. Just on some of the points that have been raised, you know, this idea of more resources or throwing more resources at the problem. Everyone can be a transparency officer if they have that reflex. I don't think the solution is just getting more people involved in, for example, transparency units. I think it's training people to have that reflex on a daily basis. So I think that's key. I think beyond that, I'll leave it at that for now. But,
thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. Now, I'm going to divide up the rest of our session into some thematic talking points, and I'll call on one of you, or I'll look for the most eager and willing respondent. And the talking points are the Ombudsman's powers, applying the regulation more evenly across the EU, making money traceable, what building up capacity means, which we've already sort of taken a deep dive into in the first few minutes here, and technology. And first, let's talk about technology if we can, and these important attempts underway to include SMSs, WhatsApps, other messaging under the access regulation. And let me put it this way, just as a talking point. And I'm going to throw this out to you, Peter. I mean, would that really have any effect? I mean, you know, wouldn't officials just madly delete everything at the end of the day anyway if they don't want it registered and then findable?
I don't quite understand why this issue of WhatsApp messages and text messages is now a thing, because the regulation says that regardless of medium, if something relating to documents or activities of the institution is discussed, it's a document. So deleting a text message is the same as deleting an email or shredding a bunch of papers that you're supposed to record. Like there's in that sense, the regulation is written technology neutral. So yeah, they should be saved if they are in terms of, you know, if they're relating to policy. And in fact, the technological argument can't be one, because we have a GDPR which says that if you're using a social media service, you should be able to download the stuff in a machine-readable format. So if the Commission is using a service where you can't download the text, well, you know, they're in violation of the GDPR, and then they can go to the Data Protection Authority, in fact.
Great, and Päivi, I saw your face light up, so I'm going to jump straight to you. I mean, is Peter right when he says, look, all of this junk already on your phone that you're setting coffee dates as well as negotiating nearly €750 billion euros. All of that stuff is already covered by 1049. Is Peter right?
Well, let's say technically, yes. I mean, the document definition is very broad, as Peter said. So that actually I don't see as an issue. Then it's, of course, also linked to the space to think exception, which the institutions are interpreting tremendously broadly, and that I see as a massive problem. But then again, I mean, there's no idea that, you know, invitations for lunch would be covered. So in that sense, it has to be policy relevant. Yes. And of course, in order to be sort of relevant for policy making, it also needs to have some sort of finality. So it's not just the sort of WhatsApp messages, brainstorming, should we do something about it? Let's talk about it next week, which should be covered. So of course, it has to have some sort of finality that makes it relevant for decision making. Helen?
I think that I totally agree that it is, the definition of document in the regulation is in fact good. At the same time, I think this debate is a bit of a distraction. As Päivi said, we should be able to get access to this information if it's relevant to a particular decision, or it's about meetings with a lobbyist or some other criteria in the public interest. The problem that lies behind this, as Heidi Hautala mentioned, is that we don't have the regulation on record keeping, on management of documents, on archiving of documents. So if, to use Vera Jourova's words, a fully fledged set of transparency rules needs to go much broader than the current regulation 1049. It needs to include how you design in transparency to your whole information system within the EU institutions. And it needs to look at both the requests for documents, and as has already been mentioned by others, the rules about proactive publication. Because right now we don't have a comprehensive set of rules on proactive publication. We have the registers, but it's really hard to find things in the registers, and often the information you're looking for is not there. We need to be thinking about what is the information that people need, and ensuring that that's made proactively public. That would require a lot of investment, because you have to invest in making everything digital, in your archivists, in capturing stuff. So it's not a question of just throwing money at the front end of answering requests when we're talking about more resources. It's a question of a strategic investment in transparency.
But there also has to be that impulse that I think was mentioned, Tanya, for officials to know when to register what. So how feasible, are you already talking to the 33,000 European Commission workers about how they know when to register what, not only in terms of documents and good old-fashioned paper and good old-fashioned emails, but also SMSs and IMs? Have you started that discussion with them?
Well, I think in the Commission we set up quite an advanced system, I think, in how we organize it internally, in the sense of how we train people so that they understand what, because at the end of the day, transparency starts and ends a little bit with each individual person, that what already was mentioned. So it's absolutely essential for us to make sure that people know the rules and they apply them as well. But so we offer a lot of trainings and so on, but going beyond that, we also have a system of having access to documents experts in each DG, usually 1 or 2 people, who are actually usually cascading basically these rules in the sense of that they really are contact points. I mean, I myself worked in DG Comp before and I wasn't an expert in access to documents, but I remember when my unit received a particular request, I would call the access to document person in DG Competition and we will go through these issues and try to see how to approach it and so on. So I think that this system really works very well. We also centrally, in Secretariat General, we hold this network of access to documents experts. We train them as well. We share this information. We also work together with other institutions on this topic and also with agencies and bodies. So I think that this approach is already working very well, but we are continuing to, of course, to look forward at the ideas how to continue improving it and spreading this information and so on. As concerns the question of SMSs and so on, we've been looking at this question, of course, and as Peter also mentioned, our regulation is kind of fit for purpose in that sense because it actually doesn't exclude any source and any medium. You know, it's more about the application, more practical application in the organization. So, and we have quite an extensive internal guidance, of course, and internal rules of what is a document, what should be registered, and so on. And when we looked at it from the context of whether we register SMS or not, basically our internal guidance says that irrespective of the medium, if there is an information that needs to be registered, however you received it, it has to be registered. So it means that we don't have a technology right now to register SMSs as such, but our guidance says that if there is this long-lasting committing institution, policy relevant, and so on, you know, information that came through the SMS, it needs to be put in some kind of format, like note to the file or something like that, and registered.
So, Rosita, this implies that, in a sense, the institutions could move to this kind of capacity almost overnight if the technology was there and the systems were there. On the other hand, we've been spending the morning talking about the possible necessity of a brand new regulation, which would obviously cover a lot more than just that. Where does the electronic messaging fit into this picture? Can we move ahead without, you know, reinventing the regulation, or do we kind of need a new regulation to really get that right?
I think we can have, or would like to have, the best of both worlds, to be honest. I don't agree that the text messaging debate is a distraction right now. I sort of feel there's a tipping point that basically with remote working, with the, you know, the fact that people, I mean, everyone goes around with their iPhone in their pocket. Everyone uses it. If you don't use it for work-related, you sometimes, many people sometimes have work phones, for example. So it has to be discussed. It has to be put on the table, even if I don't think the debate can end by saying, yes, the rules, the transparency rules cover text messages, debate over, because the reality is the reflex is not there to register them. The reflex is not there to disclose them. And they're being used for work purposes, then that reflex needs to be there. So I don't think it's a distraction. I think now is the moment to put it on the table. The Ombudsman has done that with her mapping of what the rules are across the institutions, how those rules are implemented. So I do think this is the moment to discuss that. But when you talk about changing the rules, and I go back to what Helen was talking about, you know, a few years ago, everyone was talking about the data protection reform. There's hardly an individual who doesn't know that the EU revamped its data protection regime a couple of years ago. And part of the thinking behind that revamp was data protection by design, factored in from the start. And what Helen was talking about, it's transparency by design. It's factoring it in from the start. So I think the best of both worlds would be the Ombudsman, for example, trying to make sure that the rules as they are properly interpreted and applied, but going forward, changing the rules so that transparency by design is factored in from the start. So that's the best of both worlds.
There's a branding opportunity there, which is what you're getting at. That, in fact, you know, if Europe can become globally known for the GDPR, why can it not be globally known for, you know, one of its cousins, which is access to documents, and become the global leader there? And so there are opportunities. No, Helen, is that where?
If I could just come back on that. Maybe distraction is not quite the right word, but I see a lot of focus on this particular issue. Yes, if we can use it to have a discussion and to get the data protection had its upgrade 20 years on post-Lisbon, where the right of access to information moved up to being a fundamental right, at least of citizens and residents, in line with what's happened in the wider world. Because in the last 20 years, we've had all international human rights tribunals recognize a fundamental right of access to information. So it's absolutely, I totally agree that it's time to revamp the regulation to make sure that every exception has a public interest test, for example. Nevertheless, what surprises me, I live in Madrid, I'm based in Madrid, I work with civil society in Spain trying to get information from the EU. What surprises me is that the debate's got such a focus on this particular question, but from the outside, what we see is that the EU is not leading on the highest standards for public procurement transparency, because everybody knows that the EU hasn't been transparent about the vaccine contracts, which really undermines all the EU directives that require member states to be public about their public procurement during the pandemic. And it's not completely accurate what Ms. Jourova said about the levels of transparency around the RRF funds. We don't have comprehensive rules, and we've been looking into that at Access Info, and there is a real mixed picture with member states. And it's true that member states have to report back to the Commission, but that's not necessarily going to be public. And unlike the CAP funds, which do have an explicit requirement that the member states, it's the same amount of money, by the way, about 800 billion for both funds, the Next Gen and the CAP funds. With the CAP funds, there is at least a requirement that every member state publish the beneficiaries. That requirement doesn't exist for the recovery funds. So we don't yet have that transparency. And I think that that's what people in Brussels should be talking about, because it's about accountability, fighting corruption, and defending the rule of law.
So we were going to move to the money question a bit later, so we could, not at all, but we can pick up on that, towards the end of our chat. But if I can just stay with this very granular issue of how we record stuff. There's an issue about various EU agencies and institutions interpreting the current laws and giving them effect in very different ways. So, on the one hand, we see information about certain branches of the EU developing password technologies and having to present an ID, so they make sure that it's only you who is given the document that you've requested. But then on the other hand, we hear demands for the creation of a kind of centralized portal where everything would sort of be done on in a way that everybody understands, so the methods would be the same across the EU, which again would be interesting in terms of the branding. I see things going in two different ways here, but maybe I'm portraying it too negatively. Peter, you've done some reporting on agencies, including I think the European Defence Agency. How would you assess how balkanized the system is?
Well, the European Defence Agency case is actually interesting for a different reason, because it really showed the importance of getting documents. What was the case here? A former executive director had left the agency and went on to become a lobbyist for Airbus Defence. Maybe some people in the audience are thinking, oh, that could be a conflict of interest. Indeed, and people leaving an agency are obliged to get permission after an assessment of whether or not there is such a conflict of interest. I asked the spokesperson for the European Defence Agency whether this former director had requested permission to get this new job, because it was within the 12-month period of leaving. And they said, yes, in line with the staff requirements, the request was made. What they didn't say, and I only found out after I got the documents, was that the permission was not given before he took up the new job. He actually just started the job without having been given the permission, which renders the whole asking permission useless. And so, why do journalists request documents? It's because spokespersons don't tell them the entire truth, right? So it's all one picture. Why do documents get leaked in this bubble? Because you can't get them, or you can't get them quickly through formal means. Why are people becoming increasingly Eurosceptic? Well, maybe because they've been dealing with obstruction from the EU institutions for 7 or 8 years. I don't know when I started. They're given bogus reasons for not disclosing information.
So, again, if I could, I'm glad that you shared the anecdote. It's a fascinating one. But the question, if I can come back to that, maybe Päivi, I don't know, because you really study this stuff. Have I got that right? That on the one hand, there are moves towards being even more discretionary about who the documents go to and making it harder to get a hold of that. And on the other hand, there's this growing movement to sort of create one central system, one portal, where, again, and perhaps if that existed, some of the Euroscepticism or some of the incipient Euroscepticism that some people might feel about dealing with the EU might be, that could be diminished that way.
Well, I think, basically, again, here is an issue that is actually quite well covered by the regulation already. It says institutions must have public registers, and we still don't have that, so it's a question of application. But I think something that has been discussed for many years now is a sort of interinstitutional portal that would cover at least the legislative process, so that you could enter and access everything online proactively as things emerge. That still doesn't exist, and I have such a hard time understanding why it can be such a slow and impossibly difficult process. So that we still do not have. But then again, I think there is still a need for institutional registers as well. And there I actually think, sort of being someone who requests access fairly often, the council register actually is much better than many other registers, because my understanding is that they do register entries of documents there, even if you cannot access them directly. You know that these documents exist, and then you're able to do a detailed request for individual documents, which probably also makes it easier for the institution to respond. But then many other institutions, such as the Commission in particular, but also the European Parliament, have registers that are practically, in my view, empty. They include documents COM documents, SEC documents, which you find by Google, but which make it very difficult to request information relating to anything in particular, because you don't know what exists there. And then you end up doing these very vast requests, which are difficult to manage, take time, and for the applicant, usually far too time-consuming in order to be helpful.
Tanya, that's a really interesting point. The Commission is creating unknown unknowns. You can't ask for what you don't know is there. Why, if you agree with Päivi there, why is it that the Commission has an insufficient approach to the registers?
Well, I'm not sure what PAVI exactly specifically refers to in terms of the council. Perhaps we can have a look at it, of course, and study it. But I mean, our policy is that we publish the documents or reference to the documents in our registers, official documents. So there must be a Commission official document. So in that sense, this is the purpose of institutional registers. So there I don't really see what other documents that potentially exist, but we don't publish them, what documents we're referring to in that sense. And secondly, what I wanted to add as well is that what we are talking about here is very important to think about, that it's often not only publishing of certain documents somewhere. We need to also make these documents easily foundable, you know, but also foundable in a such way that if we talk about citizens, they need to be presented in some kind of way that people can actually search without being experts in. And we've been investing recently quite a lot in the Commission in terms of our budgets and resources in order to upgrade our IT systems. We're also upgrading the registers as well, so they will be merged together and presented in a better way. The documents will be more searchable. We are also bringing up something that many people request from, in many requests for access to documents, people asking to actually give the documents that already were released, you know, as part of other, let's say, confirmatory requests. So what we are going to do now, and it's coming up in now some technical delays, but it's coming up very soon, a tool that will permit to actually, these documents released through previous confirmatory requests will be published. So of course with some reductions in terms of personal data and so on, you know, but people will be able to search in our portals for these documents and find them and download them. So I think that will be also a massive step forward in terms of usability, in terms of user friendliness, and you know, helping citizens really to get access to this information.
And of course, I mean, you know, to Päivi's point about the council, yes, I mean, its registers may be easy to use, but of course, it depends a little bit what they put in there, right? Because there is so much that doesn't go in there. Rosita, that sounds encouraging from Tanya about the register infrastructure being built out.
Yeah, no, certainly we've been exchanging with the Commission on that. Now, I do appreciate your standards are extremely high, James, because you mentioned this roving probe landing in the previous session. So I appreciate that, you know, when your standards in terms of what the EU should be capable of, but the reality is the public registers don't work very well. We have had some inquiries into them and we've tried to move them along, but they're not what was intended under the regulation. I think that's clear. I think the idea of a common portal is very ambitious, bearing your standards in mind, still very ambitious. I think it's very difficult to understand because it seems like a no-brainer, to be honest, because if applicants can't identify the documents they want, they submit these very broad requests, which are impossible for the administration to deal with, and certainly to deal with within the deadlines. So it seems such an obvious thing to do, and yet so impossible to accomplish. So all of that to say, I'm not sure why we're in this situation, but it does suggest this idea of rethinking the whole approach is something that I think we have to put on the table, and that in the first panel has been put on the table. I think even the example Päivi mentioned, the legislative, the joint database on the state of play of legislative files, even there is interinstitutional agreement, there is political agreement, and still it's not there years later. So I think all of this shows how difficult all of this is, but it has to happen at some stage. The example that Tanya mentioned of the Commission's portal, I think what will be really interesting there is for applicants and people who are interested to see the categories of documents that the Commission discloses following requests, because then they can say to the Commission, you should be disclosing this proactively. We shouldn't have to ask for this. And I think, again, it goes back to the 8,000 initial applications that, for example, the Commission, and I'm just using the Commission, Tanya, because you're here, it applies to the other institutions as well. If you have a very high percentage of success rates in response to initial applications, it does also suggest you're potentially not disclosing enough proactively, and people shouldn't necessarily have to ask for that. So I think there's a lot in the pipeline, but when we look at the public registers, it's not the most inspiring example, I think.
Peter, you wanted to jump in.
Yes, I wanted to share some of my experience when filing for documents related to lobbyist meetings. For a book I wrote, I really wanted to know more about when an EU commissioner or a cabinet member meets a lobbyist. And it's true, as Tanya said in her opening statement, that there's a transparency register and you can see who met with which commissioner. But if you then take it a step further and you want to find out what was discussed at this meeting, it turns out in many cases, in my experience, that there are no notes, no documents recording what was said at these meetings. It could be true, but I also have some evidence which shows that perhaps that's not entirely true, because in one specific case, I was told, oh, there's no document, and then I asked the spokesperson service, at this meeting, what was discussed? And she actually gave a quite detailed 3, 4, 5 sentence summary of what was discussed in this meeting. So how did they know? Did this cabinet member have a fantastic photographic memory, knowing what every lobbyist tells them over a year ago? Or is there apparently some form of document which is not registered as a document?
They do train them well. Yeah. So this is a topic that, you know, the topic of how to register the information and whether it's going to remain in separate categories, I think is something that you wanted to pick up on, Helen.
I actually wanted to come back on the question of the balkanization around Regulation 1049, because what I hear in the debate on both these panels is that we're talking a lot about the institutions, although we have had one mention of Frontex. What we have currently, and I think this is one of the reasons why we absolutely have to do a reform of Regulation 1049, I think it's really welcome, is because we have different agencies and bodies who've adapted and changed the rules in a way that I would say is possibly a violation of the treaties, because the treaties say that the only exceptions are those which have been set by the legislators. And yet we have the European Central Bank after the financial crisis, which added an exception to the list of exceptions. We have Frontex, which has changed amongst the difficulties of actually getting documents from Frontex, needing to present an ID card, having to receive it through a portal. In addition, minor thing, but it's actually important for anyone who wants to reuse information, they've taken out the language that you can request information in your preferred format, which I've had a case where we've received scanned copies, scanned Excels, a scanned version of a document, which I later discovered was on the Frontex website in a machine-readable format. And that's an undermining of what we've already got in Regulation 1049. The European Medicines Agency, just a few weeks ago, adopted a new set of rules which says that you can only, per request, have 2 documents. This is something quite new. I only discovered it this week. Because we've got a Spanish journalist who is also struggling because they keep saying, which 2 documents do you want here? I don't know which documents there are. And the conversation goes back and forth with him writing in Spanish and being answered in English. So we also need to have rules about language. So there are lots of little practical things. We need at least a harmonized minimum standard, as well as pushing up the standard, because as I said already, the world has changed, of transparency has changed a lot in the last 20 years.
Now, Frontex came up. And we've Frontex being the border and coast guard agency of the European Union. And there's a question that's come up online for Ms. Verrier from the European Commission. And the question is from Alexander Fanta, a journalist, and it goes this way. EU agency Frontex recently released WhatsApp messages of its interactions with the Libyan Coast Guard following a request under 1049. If Frontex can copy WhatsApp messages to a PDF, why can't you?
Well, as I already said, so our internal rules are that if the SMS in itself or WhatsApp message is merits, to be registered, because it's not short-lived and so on. So this number of criteria we already discussed, that it has to be registered, but it maybe not necessarily in the format of, you know, scanning or putting a photo and then, but what we suggest is to do it as a note to the file. So you just copy this text into the, you know, Word document and you save it. So this is our rule set in general, irrespective of medium. If the information meets the criteria for registration, it will be registered. It's just our practice shows that so far we haven't seen in our practice SMSs and messages that actually met the registration criteria.
Can I ask a question there? If a request comes in, does the document have to have been registered already? Or can it not be the case that when the request comes in, you do a scan to find out which documents exist, whether or not they've been registered, if you see the difference?
Well, I think our rules apply to the documents that exist. So we don't draw now a document because suddenly somebody requested for some information and we start drawing the document.
But if I've got the WhatsApps in my phone, they exist, even if they haven't been registered as a document.
Yeah, but I mean, the responsibility for registering lays, we have more than 30,000 people. As we discussed, the responsibility for registering lies with people who are operating with this information. And it is for them, according to our rules, to decide at every stage, irrespective of a technical, you know, medium, to decide whether this particular information or this document needs to be registered. Following certain criteria, that is again policy relevant, that it's not short-lived, and so on. And we think that in general these rules are being followed, and that's why we introduce the trainings and all the system of networks and so on.
I mean, this is a fascinating point because in some ways it gets to culture, right? And if indeed there is this personal responsibility, which, I mean, how else can one do it if it's in your phone, right? I mean, maybe there are other ways. I don't want to rule them out. Clearly, there are going to be certain people from certain member states, and I don't want to generalize at all, who will take the approach, you know what, it's just not going to be my first reflex. And then other people from other member states, perhaps the Nordics, who would say, you know what, gosh, I'm just going to put everything in there, including my lunch dates. Now, Tanya and perhaps Rosita, how do the institutions overcome that? Surely there's a job of work to do in terms of you know, creating a unified culture when it comes to reporting what's in your phone.
Well, yeah, I think it will partly come down to, training, as has been mentioned, but also not forgetting that it can be useful to have some of this material. If you're asked to explain how a decision was taken, if you're asked for evidence, if you're asked from an institutional memory perspective, it can have advantages. I don't think there's any suggestion that people are across the board embarrassed or ashamed of what they're writing on their mobile phones if that's how they're exchanging, for example. So to be honest, I think part of it is reassuring people that this is just a normal part of the work. Of course, as I said, I feel the tipping point is that the reflex really hasn't been there because people haven't necessarily been using mobile devices for work purposes or feeling that necessarily whatever is being done on mobile phones is decisive or committal or commits, for example, as some of the things that have been mentioned. But that is changing, and the Ombudsman is trying to accompany that change and instill good practices and good reflexes. But I don't think people have anything to be afraid of. I think we should assume the best, and that people actually, individual civil servants, will have an interest in documenting this type of thing because it will serve a valuable purpose.
If I can add as well. So of course we are not only relying to training the staff. You know, I think we have a quite I think advanced system of overall internal control system. That each Director General is responsible for the organization of operation in each DG. There are a certain number of internal controls, and access to documents is one of the elements. So certain processes need to be organized in every DG how it is being handled. We're collecting statistics on how each DG is performing. The statistics is being sent also to each Director General. So I mean, there is quite a lot of steps that are put in place to ensure that it's not only a decision by each individual person, but it's actually there is an accountability by each Director General also for how the operations are organized in each service or DG.
Päivi.
Can I come in with the story? Some years ago, I was trying to write about the European Public Prosecutor's Office, the setting up, and those of you who know the file know that it has a lot of legal complications in it. And I wrote to the Commission and I said I would be interested in seeing the legal advice given to the Commission on this particular issue. There's nothing in the register, so I cannot address it in any more detailed terms. The reply I get is that thank you for your request. We have no legal advice on this issue, which I find absolutely incredible, thinking that it is an issue, it's a file that is built with legal complications, that the Commission would come forward with a proposal without any legal analysis. I was sitting with this, I was thinking, and then some weeks later I got another message saying, please ignore the message we sent to you earlier. We have looked into the matter again. And we have actually found, was it 8 pieces of legal advice. However, we're of course not very willing to give much of that to you. But to me, that brings a question about what these registers are like that they're using in order to reply to the questions. I mean, they should know themselves. There seems to be a public register. There is an internal register, which is not really working that well. And this is actually a case that we also brought to the Ombudsman, and with the request that the Ombudsman would start a systemic investigation into how these registers are working. The Ombudsman promised to look into this, so I'm hoping that time would come soon.
Peter?
Yeah, if I can add. Indeed, this is more than just an issue of transparency. It's of knowing whether the institutions are efficiently organized. I just spoke with a commissioned civil servant who said, "Oh, suddenly my emails from 6 months ago, I can't find them again, you know, because of what Der Spiegel reported on." If you can't find, you know, what you've discussed with whom, you're not going to be a very efficient organization. So it's also paramount that the institutions themselves are able to have the institutional memory and be able to retrieve the documents that they need to do their jobs.
On the question of efficiency, really briefly, we heard efficiency being balanced against transparency, and I find that incredibly worrying. You've talked to public officials around the world who've had to implement access to information rules, particularly proactive publication rules, where they have to organize their information and get it out. And they will all tell you, in all honesty, that it's made their internal functioning more efficient as well. So it's not one against the other. They go hand in hand.
Thank you. Can I have a show of hands in the room for people who'd like to come in? We have a question there, and if you could introduce yourself and give us any affiliation you might have. No, we can't. You need to lift the mic up and press the speak button. Is the light on the speak button? I think we will if you speak really loudly. Yeah, thank you.
Access to information is time sensitive. That's recognised in the Treaty of European Union, because we need it to participate in decision making. So we need to have it when it's relevant, and it's also why there are deadlines in the regulation. So I just wanted to ask if you're taking any steps at the moment to try to deal with this crisis situation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was Client Earth asking about really, waiting very, very long periods of time and having to go to court?
Well, in general, I think we have the deadlines that you know about, and we are maintaining the deadlines more or less in many requests. But of course, as you know, we have also basically what we see is a growth in a complicated request, and the documents where we have, let's say, commercial parties, commercial interests, commercial business secrets, and also the documents with the member states, where we really need to go back to the member states, asking them, consulting them, whether we can release certain documents or certain part of the information. Often we get a reply that not, and so we might need to go back and discuss and try to convince, for example, a member state to still agree, because if member states tells us not to release certain information and it is their information, so we basically cannot release it then. So I think that it's actually becoming quite a complicated process for some of the files, and it leads to that kind of delays.
Rosita.
Yeah, I think I'll be going home with a charge sheet in terms of the work that the Ombudsman will have to do. But Päivi mentioned the public registers, and I think delays, that's another area that we really will need to look into. What tends to happen is that we get a case, we look at it on the substance, because that's what really matters to the complainant. They want to know, will they get the document or not? And they sort of leave to the side the fact that they've waited a long time to even get to that refusal stage. And so we don't tend to then focus on the delays that have been encountered in the process. But I think it is something that from a systemic perspective, the Ombudsman really could think about looking at, because it does really matter. As I said, in a case-by-case basis, what matters for the applicant are the documents. But from the systemic perspective, I think addressing the issue of delays is something. And I appreciate the consultations that have to take place. And people always talk about 15 working days. It sounds so short, but the initial stage is 6 weeks in total, and the confirmatory stage is 6 weeks in total if you apply the extension. So looking at it from that perspective, it actually is quite long.
Yeah, and from the perspective of the journalist or the civil society activist or the lawyer, it seems like inequality of arms, because on the one hand, the institutions can kind of, they can hazard delays without really paying a price for it, whereas we lose our opportunity to make requests if we don't make the request within those time frames. Peter.
Yeah, this is exactly what happened to me. I wanted to file a confirmatory application, but I couldn't do it within 15 working days, so I was told, sorry, no cigar. Even when this same Secretary General is keeping me waiting for weeks and months on end. And I don't buy the argument that it's because of consultations. Because if you consult a member state or a commercial party, you tell them there's a deadline. You have to reply within that period of time. And I also like to make the point that the Commission and the other institutions, they agreed with these deadlines, right? It's a regulation. That didn't just come, from planet Mars. It's something that they agreed to. If they can't reach those deadlines, they have to make some internal changes, whether that's more staff or better document registers, I don't know. But you can't just say, oh, it's too difficult, so we can't do it. And the one funny, if it wasn't tragic, example of why it's not only consultations that can cause delays, I requested a lobby meeting document from DG Justice. This is the DG responsible for rule of law in member states, right? They needed 153 working days to establish that the Commission does not hold any documents that would correspond to the description of your application.
I mean, in straightforward journalistic terms, that is a way for an institution to say, don't report this story. Because if you don't have the document, then you cannot actually often write a complete story, and that's no way to run a railroad, right? So, was there any more response to what the Client Earth person had to say?
Päivi wanted to come in.
Päivi.
Go on.
I could just add, my experience, I don't think I've ever received a document within the prescribed deadline. So that maybe tells you something. I tried to make very detailed requests. So in that sense, it's not a question of very broad applications. However, I also have researchers that are doing sort of more systemic analysis. And for that, of course, you need more data. And these requests, I think, are becoming tremendously difficult because the institutions, the Commission, for example, some of the agencies, ECHA, for example, they apply this queuing system where you're told, Helen already referred to this, that they give you some documents and then they will tell you when we've assessed this first bulk, which we will define ourselves, then you can make a new request, but you cannot make that new request before we've handled the first request, which sort of turns it into a very, very long story. And for a researcher with funding deadlines, for example, it might just make that research impossible.
Rosita, you wanted to come in.
Just to defend the institutions, if I may, because we are a very balanced organisation, obviously, and don't always find in favour of the complainants, but the alternative in those queuing situations is that the agency or institution would simply deny the request by saying, look, it's too extensive, we can't deal with it within the deadlines. So I think we have found that to be a rather reasonable way of dealing with what can be very, very complicated requests. I'm not saying across the board it's acceptable, but it is potentially a better solution than being told, well, we simply can't deal with it within the deadline.
And here I must say we do disagree with the Ombudsman position on this, because I think what we've been left with is that it's the institution that defines which documents are relevant for your research. And that shouldn't be the case. That if there's a need to narrow down, then obviously it should be the person making the request who defines what is relevant for the research, not the institution with the Ombudsman's blessing.
Okay, one last word on Q-Gate.
Once it's the last word, no rebuttals. But no, just to say that you're absolutely right. You should determine, and in fact that's what we've said, that the institution should list for you what the documents are, and you should say in what order they're dealt with. So I think finally we agree.
We agree on that.
Very good. Can I turn back to the room to see any other hands going up? Please don't hesitate. Yes, please. And you know where the microphone is? It's in your... Okay, if you could try and use the microphone, that would be great, because that records on the video.
Yeah, thank you. So my name is Natasha Thanasiadou. I'm a member of Cabinet of Commissioner Johannes Hahn in charge of budget and administration, and I'm also a researcher in Maastricht University working on transparency and citizen participation. So my question is, if I understand correctly from the discussion, the regulation covers more or less all the concerns, and the problem is more the application of it. In case the regulation is indeed reviewed, then would you advocate in favor of more detailed rules? So the concepts that we now have in the regulation that are more detailed so that we guarantee better application, for example, as mentioned about proactive transparency, or like what we disclose in case of meetings with lobbyists, the minutes. So would you actually add new elements, new concepts, or would you just would like to invest in more detailed rules so that the application is then more uniform? Thank you very much.
Who would like to field that? Helen?
To get the ball rolling, thank you for the question. I think that there are things that need to be strengthened in the regulation and or brought up to the current international standards, including comparative law and practice. Every single member state now has an access to information law, which wasn't the case 20 years ago. Most of them didn't 20 years ago. And standards such as the Council of Europe's Convention on Access to Official Documents, which requires, for example, that every single exception have not only a harm but also a public interest test, which is not what we have. There has to be, even if it's international relations or other things, there has to be a consideration of the public interest in disclosing the information. There are various other rules which could be more specific, more clearly expressed, more detailed, so that we don't have these get-outs from them, such as not accepting requests by email, which various institutions have tried over the years, and some currently do not accept requests by email. The timeframes. If you look at national access to information laws, you will have plenty of detailed rules on timeframes, not just the timeframe for answering, but the timeframe for a clarification, the timeframe for a consultation, and so on. So there's a lot that we've learned, and I think again, we're here in the Brussels bubble. I would really urge this debate that happens to step outside Brussels and look at the comparative best practice from member states. It was really interesting, if I didn't misunderstand it, when Heidi Hautala called for a broad public consultation, I think Vera Jourova suggested that she would consult with the other two institutions. We're talking about a broad public consultation. Bring the member states in, bring civil society around Europe in. There is a reform needed, and there is a lot of comparative good practice which we could draw upon, and I think that's exactly what we should do.
Okay, Päivi.
Yeah, just about the question of what should be changed. I mean, I said earlier that I think change in law doesn't necessarily mean that there will be change in implementation practice. However, there are elements in this regulation which are outdated, and just to add to Helen's list, I think international relations is an area which has dramatically changed since 2001. We've got new types of agreements that are very broad, that take sort of legislative character. That's an area where the Ombudsman has done a tremendous job with the current regulation. However, the law needs to change there in order to reflect the new types of agreements. Data protection, of course, is another area, the balancing question. We've got a lot of things that are now covered by consent rules, which actually have a strong public interest element in them, which I think should be disclosed. And then, of course, there are also, elements in case law which are not particularly successful from a transparency point of view, which would also need to be reconsidered and not just codified as they stand.
Terrific. Okay, I hope that addresses your question. Excellent. Now, we're coming to the end of our time. There is a question out there on proactive disclosure and the resources that it would take to do proactive disclosure in a really effective way. I'm going to park that just for the moment and let anyone who wants to come back in on that do so in the final question, which I would like to put this way. What are your thoughts on giving the European Ombudsman binding powers so that what she decides has a sort of mandatory effect rather than an advisory effect? Who would like to jump in first on that?
Well, my boss is in the front row, so absolutely binding powers for the European Ombudsman. No, I think it absolutely has to be put on the table. There are some member states it clearly works, and I think unless you have that, the reality is that the ultimate decision makers when it comes to who gets to see what are the institutions whose documents you're talking about. So until you move the discussion in that direction, the reality is they're the gatekeepers, they decide, and that's a problem. But in the meantime, if I could just ask that unless and until the Ombudsman has binding powers, it would be good if we could be understood as an ombudsman, because the reality is that we're not a court, we don't annul decisions, but very often the types of arguments we're faced with by the institutions are like they're before a court and defending the confirmatory decision at all costs. So while we are an ombudsman that doesn't have binding powers, I think it's really important that the institutions engage with us on that playing field and take into account developments that have happened since the confirmatory decision, respond to the Ombudsman's invitation to revisit a decision. So until that glory day comes of binding powers, I think it would be really useful in the meantime if we could be understood in terms of what we actually do, which is an Ombudsman inviting the institutions to change their ways.
Peter, were you first on to come back? Sorry,
ladies first.
Thank you. I'm going to reply to this as the EU lawyer that I am by training. And my answer is that, of course, this is a question that would require treaty reform because the Ombudsman's mandate comes from the treaties, and I think it's quite explicit on what the Ombudsman should do. So I wouldn't stretch too much the law there. I think what is more relevant there is the question of authority, that she is taken seriously and her recommendations are taken seriously. And I think there is an element there which does concern me a little bit, being someone who's also worked within the council a great deal, and that is the question of independence in relation to the institutions, and that all are scrutinized on an equal basis. And I think especially in some of the institutions, there may be sentiments that some institutions are scrutinized more heavily than others. And that, of course, also builds into how remarks are accepted and implemented in practice, that they are considered fair in that sense.
Peter, before you jump in, I'd like to turn to Tanya.
Okay, well, yes, thanks. I don't know, part of your question was also on proactive publication.
It was
right?
about proactive publication, so if you could combine that with binding powers.
On the proactive publication, I think it's a very important element of our overall approach. And we've seen, for example, in the Brexit negotiations, we've been very proactively publishing the documents, and there I think it was a very successful example. Where we didn't even have very many requests for information.
But it was a strategic choice.
Yes.
I mean, it was discretionary.
Yes, we also proactively publish a lot of documents in the trade negotiations and in some other fields. So I think this is the area where we really want to go forward and explore it more. Perhaps talking about transparency by design or whatever we call it, but I think this is a thinking which we should be indeed developing, and we are thinking very proactively about it. So,
and on binding powers, would you have a thought on that?
Yes, on binding powers, what I wanted also to say is that, of course, the institutional setup in the EU is very carefully crafted. And so, it's also set up in the treaty. So, in that sense, we also feel that any changes to Ombudsman powers would actually require treaty change that I don't think it's particularly on the table right now. But also what we feel is that this institutional setup is very well designed because we have this instrument of Ombudsman which complements the instrument of courts that are supervising the implementation of 1049 with the binding ruling power. But the Ombudsman brings in this more flexible instrument that permits to bring in this kind of mediation power and possibility for friendly solution finding.
Indeed, and in some cultures, of course, the culture of the Ombudsman, the culture of the Information Commissioner, that's, again, you know, it does vary across the EU what that role should be. Peter, I'm sorry to keep you waiting.
Don't worry, no. I'm just getting a little bit, well, I don't want to say depressed, but it's sad to see that we have to discuss giving binding powers to the Ombudsman, because that would imply that her decisions are not being taken seriously if there's no consequence. I mean, the reason we have an ombudsman looking at complaints on access to documents, to me, it's an independent look at whether the arguments are sound and safe, right? I cannot look through the redacted documents, so I don't know whether the exceptions are used make any sense. The ombudsman can, because she can look at the actual documents. But in the end, it's all going to come down to what the institutions do with their own responsibility, and they can already start doing that today. There is no reason to, and I'll end with a final example. The EU sponsored a Donald Duck weekly magazine in the Netherlands, which was EU themed, and they didn't want to release the cost, but they're supposed to release the cost of their procurement anyway, and they did so through the official channel. So why were they redacting that in the first place? And why were they redacting the word Disney as commercially sensitive information, as if nobody knows the relation between Donald Duck and Disney? I mean, it's just the obstructions are sometimes ridiculous.
Thank you, Peter. A last word from me before I bring in Helen and then invite the Ombudsman to say a final word. This recorded conference is going to be available on the Ombudsman's YouTube channel, so you can go back for the entire serving or just the greatest hits. So invite you to do that. Helen, a final word from the panel, and then over to the Ombudsman.
Just on this question of the binding powers, I understand the complexities of the treaty change. I think that there are things that could be done in a reform of Regulation 1049 to strengthen the consequences, or to put in consequences for bodies which don't comply with the Ombudsman's decisions. That's something we should look at. There is, again, a lot of comparative there are a lot of comparative examples from the national level about strong oversight that we could draw on. But once again, and perhaps this is the note on which to end, just to remind ourselves what's happened in the last 20 years, as well as the information society, which has radically changed citizens' expectations of information. When it comes to access to information, access to documents as it is at the EU level. We've moved from something that's an administrative good practice 20 years ago to a fundamental right of citizens. And that right needs to be strongly protected, and everything we can do to ensure that the Ombudsman is able to strongly protect that right on behalf of the citizens would be very welcome.
Ombudsman, may I invite you to say a few final words?
Thank you very much. Just in relation to this question about binding powers for the Ombudsman, as the current Ombudsman, I'd like to say something about that. I have never, I swear, I firmly believe in the institution of the Ombudsman, and I firmly believe in it as a part of the rule of law mechanism, part of the soft law mechanism, and I think that the day when you actually need to give the Ombudsman binding powers, not in relation to FOI, I would hold out on that one, is the day when the European administration is really in trouble. Because I believe that the Ombudsman is only as good as an administration allows him or her to be. And if the administration decides that they're not going to listen to the Ombudsman, then actually that's a problem for the administration and not for the Ombudsman. In relation to, and you find that in countries where there are poor rule of law adherence, democratic values are being trashed, that's where you find Ombudsman not being listened to. So actually, in a way, the Ombudsman in the European system acts as the canary in the mine, you know? We are a tester for how good the administration is. I have spoken before about the creation of an information commissioner. It doesn't have to be me. It doesn't have to be the Ombudsman. But just take the Irish example. When the FOI Act was created in Ireland in the late 1990s, the minister at the time judged that the administration in Ireland was had such a culture of secrecy about it that they would not listen, that they would not accept recommendations only in relation to to access to documents. So she made a decision to make a separate information commissioner under a different statute with the binding powers. Now, I held both roles. I was the Ombudsman, I made recommendations very successfully. I think only once in my time was a recommendation rejected, and it was actually subsequently fixed many years later. But anyway, but as information commissioner, I had binding powers, and that meant if the institution didn't like a recommendation I made, not a recommendation, a decision I made to release a document, they had to take me to court. So it wasn't down to the poor citizen to have to go all the way to the court. That job could be done. And what it did was it rebalanced the relationship between the citizen and the administration. In the EU administration at the moment, while it does many, many wonderful things, it controls the tap of information. It decides whether it's going to release or not. And in relation to, I wasn't quite sure what point you were making as to the Ombudsman investigating certain institutions in a particular way that might turn. You might explain that to me over sandwich. But everything we do in the public interest, and we do not expect to be victimized in any way because we are inquiring into an institution in the public interest. So after that rant, I shall let you go and have a sandwich. Thank you.
Round of applause for our panel, please. Thank you all. Lunch is served.
Thank you, James, for moderating.